A video spreads across the whole city overnight, revealing that the broke cab driver named Ethan is actually Ethan Cole, sole heir to one of the wealthiest families in the country. The woman behind the video is Madison, who once mocked him for being poor but came rushing back the moment she learned the truth. Worse still, Grace, the only woman who ever loved him with nothing to his name, sees the same video and realizes she was never truly chosen, only tested. Now the question is simple. Will she forgive him, or will she be the one who finally brings his whole world crashing down? Before we get into this one, hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications, because this story only gets more intense from here, and you will not want to miss where it goes. Ethan Cole was the only heir to one of the largest business empires in the country, a family whose name alone could open any door in the city. He had grown up surrounded by mansions, private drivers, and executives who bowed their heads the moment he walked into a room. Yet somewhere between the luxury cars and the boardroom meetings, Ethan had learned a bitter truth that never left him alone at night. None of that respect was ever meant for him. It was meant for the money, and for the weight of the name Cole attached to his signature. Every woman who had ever stepped into his life seemed to arrive with a list already prepared in her mind. One asked for a new car within weeks. Another needed help paying off a debt that never seemed to have an end. A few had staged entire crises, fake emergencies designed only to test how far his wallet could stretch. Ethan stopped counting how many times he had been used long before he stopped feeling the sting of it. The question that kept him awake was simple and merciless. If he had nothing left, no fortune, no name, nothing but himself, would anyone still choose to stay? That question eventually became a decision. Ethan packed away his tailored suits, left his father's estate without a word, and rented a narrow room above a noodle shop on the edge of town. He bought an old, rusted cab, the kind that rattled every time it hit a pothole, and told everyone who asked that his name was simply Ethan, a driver trying to make ends meet like anyone else. There was no plan beyond that. He only wanted to know, once and for all, whether love could exist without a price tag attached to it. The first weeks behind the wheel stripped away every illusion he had about what poverty actually felt like. Passengers shouted at him over fares that amounted to pocket change back in his old life. A toll collector once threatened to have his cab impounded over a payment delay of less than a day. Fuel prices ate through nearly everything he earned, and the engine broke down so often that he began sleeping with a wrench under his pillow, half expecting to need it before sunrise. Worse than the exhaustion was the way people looked straight through him now, as though the man who used to receive handshakes and invitations had simply stopped existing. 2 women crossed his path during those early weeks, and both left him more certain than ever that his fears had been justified. Brianna smiled at him kindly at first, complimenting his work ethic before quietly mentioning a phone bill she could not cover, then a hairdressing appointment, and finally $200 for rent she claimed was overdue. When Ethan gently explained he barely had enough for gas, she stopped answering his calls within days. Madison came next, softer in her approach, telling him he was a good man trapped in bad circumstances. But the moment she was spotted beside a wealthy businessman outside a downtown restaurant, she denied ever knowing him, calling him nothing more than a cab driver who had forgotten his place. Kindness, she said loud enough for others to hear, could not pay anyone's bills. By the time both encounters had run their course, Ethan sat alone in his cab one evening, seriously considering abandoning the entire experiment. He told himself he already had his answer, that no one behind the wheel of a broken-down cab was worth loving for free. It was on that same night, driving through a part of the city he barely recognized, that he picked up a passenger who would quietly unravel everything he thought he understood about people. Her name was Grace, and she carried herself differently than anyone else who had climbed into his back seat that month. She worked long hours selling homemade meals from a small cart near the market, using every dollar she earned to care for her mother, who had been fighting a long illness. When another passenger mocked Ethan for driving such an old, embarrassing car, Grace spoke up without hesitation, telling the man that hard work deserved respect, not ridicule. She paid her fare in full, counted out carefully from a worn envelope, and looked Ethan directly in the eyes before stepping out. "God bless your hustle," she told him, and walked away without waiting for a response. Those 4 words followed Ethan long after she disappeared down the street. He had heard countless compliments in his life, most of them empty, most of them designed to lead somewhere. This one asked for nothing in return. For the first time since starting this experiment, Ethan allowed himself to believe that maybe, somewhere in this city, there was a woman who could see him clearly, without knowing anything about the name Cole. Over the following weeks, Ethan found reasons to drive near the market more often than his route required. Grace never once treated their growing friendship as a transaction. She shared food with him when she assumed he had not eaten, and she spoke about the future with a kind of quiet confidence that had nothing to do with money. One afternoon, sitting outside her cart while her mother rested nearby, she told him plainly that she could fall in love with a cab driver if he was honest, kind, and willing to work hard for the people he loved. She said it without knowing the weight those words carried for the man sitting across from her. Ethan felt something shift inside him during those weeks, something he had not expected when he first drove away from his father's estate. He was falling for Grace, fully and without calculation, yet every day that passed made the secret sitting behind his chest heavier. He told himself he would explain everything eventually, that once he trusted the ground beneath them, he would find the right moment to reveal who he truly was. What he never admitted, not even to himself, was that he was terrified of the way her eyes might change the instant she learned the truth. That fear cost him the choice of timing entirely. Madison, still bitter over the humiliation of being rejected twice by a man she believed had nothing to offer her, happened to be walking through an upscale part of the city one evening. She spotted Ethan stepping out of his cab and climbing into the back seat of a black sedan waiting at the curb. Curiosity pulled her closer, and what she saw next erased any doubt she had about walking away. A man in a tailored suit greeted him as Mr. Cole, handing him a folder stamped with the logo of one of the largest companies in the country. Madison stayed hidden behind a parked vehicle, recording every second on her phone with hands that trembled from disbelief. She spent the rest of the night searching his name online, piecing together photographs, headlines, and business articles until the picture became impossible to deny. The broke cab driver she had mocked and abandoned was, in fact, Ethan Cole, heir to a fortune most people in this city could never imagine. Madison returned to him the following day with an entirely different tone, apologizing sweetly and insisting she had always sensed there was something different about him. When Ethan made it clear he wanted nothing to do with her, the rejection struck a nerve she could not swallow quietly. Within hours, she uploaded the footage to every platform she could find, attaching a caption designed to spread as far and as fast as possible. "Poor cab driver exposed," it read. "He is actually a billionaire testing women." The video moved through the city faster than either of them could have predicted. Former passengers recognized his face in the comments. Vendors near the market began whispering about the man who used to sit outside Grace's cart every afternoon. By the time the story reached her directly, Grace was standing exactly where their friendship had first taken root, staring at a screen that showed the man she loved dressed in a suit, addressed by a name she had never once heard him use. She found him later that evening outside his rented room, the old cab parked crookedly against the curb behind him. Her voice remained steady, though something underneath it had clearly cracked. She asked him plainly whether she had been his girlfriend this entire time, or simply a subject in an experiment he had designed for his own curiosity. Ethan opened his mouth to explain, to soften the truth somehow, then realized there was no version of this conversation where softening would help either of them. He told her everything. He told her about the women who had used him before, about the question that haunted him at night, about the decision to disappear into a life with nothing, so he could finally learn the difference between love and convenience. Grace listened without interrupting, her expression unreadable until he finished speaking. She did not deny the feelings she had for him, and that admission seemed to cost her more than anger ever could have. What hurt her most was not the lie itself, but the fact that an entire city now knew her private affection had unknowingly served as evidence in someone else's test. Before walking away, Grace turned back one final time. She told him that if he ever wanted to stand in front of her again, he would need to prove something far more difficult than wealth or honesty about his name. He would need to prove that he saw her as a person worth loving, not as a woman who had simply passed an examination he had quietly designed. She left him standing alone beside the cab that had started everything, The same cab that now felt heavier than any inheritance he had ever been handed. The days that followed the video were unlike anything Ethan had prepared himself for. Reporters camped outside the noodle shop where he had been renting his room. Strangers filmed him from across the street, and even people who had once shouted at him for driving too slowly now smiled and waved as though nothing had happened. Brianna resurfaced within 48 hours, claiming publicly that her earlier demands had only been a test of his humility. Madison appeared on a local talk show, describing herself as the woman who had helped the public see the truth. Neither of them seemed to notice or care that the truth they were selling had cost someone else everything. Grace bore a different kind of attention entirely. Strangers recognized her at the market, some congratulating her as though she had won a prize, others accusing her outright of having known his identity from the very beginning. A woman she had never met once stopped by her cart just to ask how it felt to trick a billionaire into falling for her. Grace said nothing in response, though Ethan could see, every time he came looking for her, how much heavier she carried herself under the weight of a story she had never asked to be part of. He found her 3 days after the video spread, standing behind her cart with her mother resting nearby on a folding chair. He apologized without excuses this time, admitting plainly that the experiment had begun as a way to test the women around him, but that somewhere along the way she had become the one testing him instead. Grace listened in silence before finally speaking, her voice quiet but unwavering. She told him she could consider forgiving him, but only if he agreed to conditions that left no room for half measures. She asked him never to hide anything from her again, no matter how small it seemed. She asked him not to use money to smooth over mistakes, the way his family had likely used it their entire lives. She asked him to defend her publicly, not privately, so the world that had mocked her would see exactly where he stood. Finally, she asked him to introduce her to his parents as the woman he loved, not as some contestant who had survived a secret trial. Ethan agreed to every condition without hesitation, believing perhaps naively that the hardest part of proving himself was already behind him. The dinner at the Cole estate proved otherwise almost immediately. Richard Cole, Ethan's father, greeted Grace with a politeness so rigid it barely qualified as warmth, while his mother studied her clothing and her manner of speech as though grading an exam Grace had not been told she was taking. When Grace mentioned she sold homemade meals from a cart to support her sick mother, the silence that followed said more than any comment could have. Before dessert had even been served, Richard pulled Ethan aside and told him plainly that this relationship needed to end before it caused any further damage to the family name. Ethan refused, though the refusal did little to soften what came next. Over the following days, Richard escalated his demands, insisting that the scandal had already weakened the company's standing with several investors, and that Ethan needed to return to his role, rebuild his image, and let the relationship with Grace quietly disappear. Ethan realized, somewhere in the middle of another tense conversation, that this was no longer the same decision he had once made while pretending to be poor. This time, nothing about the choice in front of him was a test. He would either keep the life waiting for him at Cole Enterprises, or he would keep Grace, and he would not get both. He made his decision in front of nearly everyone who mattered to his father. At a dinner meant to reintroduce him to the board members and business partners who had followed the scandal closely, Ethan stood and said, calmly but firmly, that Grace was not a poor woman he had chosen out of pity. She was the only person who had ever respected him when she believed he had nothing to offer in return. He apologized publicly for the lie he had told, and he made it clear that he would not abandon her simply to protect an image the family valued more than honesty. Richard's fury arrived swiftly and without mercy. Within a week, Ethan's bank cards were frozen, his car and apartment were reclaimed, and his name was formally removed from every position he had held at the company. His father added one final condition, forbidding him from using the Cole name to earn a living in any capacity, as though even the syllables of his own identity now belonged exclusively to someone else. The life Ethan had once pretended to live, the broken-down cab and the narrow rented room, was no longer a costume he could remove at the end of the day. It had become the only life left to him. 2 months passed under the weight of that new reality. Ethan returned to driving the same cab, though its engine now failed more often than it ran, and he spent entire mornings waiting in line for fuel he could barely afford. Grace continued selling meals from her cart, quietly setting aside a portion of her earnings to help him whenever his income fell short. She never complained about the sacrifice, though Ethan began noticing something troubling in the way she looked at him during the quiet hours after work, a sadness that seemed to grow heavier the longer their situation dragged on. What weighed on Grace most was a truth she rarely said out loud. Before meeting her, Ethan had owned a company, a home, and a future already secured. Now he spent his evenings repairing an engine that refused to stay fixed, and Grace could not shake the feeling that loving her had somehow become the very thing dismantling his life. She began to believe, quietly and without telling him, that the kindest thing she could do was set him free before the damage became permanent. At her urging, Ethan reluctantly agreed to speak with his father one more time. Richard offered to restore everything, the accounts, the properties, the position at the company, but only under one condition. Ethan would need to marry Victoria Hale, the daughter of one of the family's most important business partners, a union Richard had been quietly arranging for months. Ethan refused immediately, telling his father there was no version of his future that included marrying a stranger to satisfy a business arrangement. Grace understood, better than anyone, that Ethan would never leave her willingly, not even to save himself from the life he was now trapped in, so she made a decision she never discussed with him beforehand. Over the following days, she grew distant, criticizing the cab, the rented room, and the exhausting cycle of poverty she claimed she could no longer endure. She borrowed the same words that had once wounded Ethan when they came from Brianna and Madison, telling him kindness could not pay rent, and that she wanted a man with an actual future ahead of him. Ethan sat across from her one evening, watching a version of Grace he barely recognized, and something inside him refused to believe what he was hearing. He searched her expression for the smallest crack in the story, but Grace had prepared herself too carefully to let anything slip. Finally, she looked directly into his eyes and told him plainly that she no longer loved him, and that he should return home and marry Victoria the way his father wanted. Ethan left without another word, the sound of the door closing behind him louder than anything he had heard in months. On the other side of that door, Grace collapsed onto the floor of her small room, sobbing in a way she had not allowed herself to during any of the difficult months before. She told herself she had done the right thing, that letting him go was the only gift she still had left to give him. Ethan returned to his father's estate the following week and agreed to everything Richard demanded. His accounts were restored, his position at the company reinstated, and preparations for the wedding to Victoria began almost immediately. The ceremony itself was extravagant beyond anything Ethan had imagined, filled with guests, cameras, and toasts from people who barely knew either of them. Standing beside Victoria, in front of hundreds of witnesses, Ethan found himself thinking only of a narrow rented room, a broken-down cab, and a plate of food once shared with him by a woman who had asked for nothing in return. The marriage soured almost as quickly as it began. Victoria treated the household staff with open contempt, spent money without any restraint, and demanded that Ethan perform affection for cameras and guests that he no longer felt capable of faking. He fulfilled his obligations as a husband on the surface, attending events and shaking the correct hands, but the part of him that once believed in love without conditions remained somewhere back at Grace's small cart near the market. A few weeks after the wedding, Grace began noticing changes in her own body that she could no longer explain away as exhaustion or grief. A visit to the clinic confirmed what she had started to suspect, though the news that followed left her stunned in a way nothing else had. She was carrying not one child, but three, a boy and two girls growing inside her at the very moment the man she loved was living out a marriage he never wanted. Grace made the decision, alone in that small clinic room, that Ethan would never learn the truth from her. He had a wife now, a name to protect, and a life she refused to interrupt with a secret this large. The months ahead demanded more from Grace than anything she had faced before. She continued selling meals from her cart late into her pregnancy, using every dollar to cover her mother's medical bills and the rent on their small apartment. Her body grew weaker with each passing week, stretched thin between the demands of three lives growing inside her, and the responsibility of caring for the one who had raised her. Somewhere across the city, in a mansion filled with everything money could provide, Ethan lived surrounded by wealth he no longer wanted, entirely unaware that he was about to become a father 3 times over. The cracks in Ethan's marriage became impossible to ignore after a dinner meant to celebrate his father's newest business deal. Victoria arrived late, dismissed the household staff in front of the guests, and spent the evening complaining loudly about the quality of the wine before disappearing early without an explanation. Richard watched the entire display in silence, his expression shifting from irritation to something closer to regret. For the first time since arranging the marriage, he seemed to understand that he had traded his son's happiness for a woman who offered the family nothing but a respectable last name. That same week, guilt over how he had treated Grace finally caught up with Richard in a way he could not ignore. He had quietly arranged for someone to check on her condition months earlier, telling himself it was simple due diligence rather than concern, though the reports he received had gone unread until now. When he finally reviewed them, he learned that Grace was pregnant, that her health had declined, and that she was struggling to cover both her mother's medical care and her own. Richard decided to see the situation for himself, driving to the market where she still sold meals despite how far along her pregnancy had become. He found her sitting outside her cart, visibly exhausted, her hands trembling slightly as she counted change for a customer. Richard approached without his usual authority, asking her directly who the father of her children was. Grace said nothing, though the silence that followed answered the question more clearly than words ever could. Richard stood there for a long moment, recalling the night he had called her a woman who sold food on the roadside and demanded she leave his home, never imagining she would one day be carrying his own grandchildren while he stood by and did nothing. The weight of that realization settled over him fully as he studied her tired face and the strain in her posture. He understood, perhaps for the first time in his life, that his pride had not protected his family the way he believed it would. It had instead pushed away the one person who had loved his son honestly, leaving her to carry that love alone through hardship no parent should allow. Without saying much else, Richard arranged for Grace to be moved into a private home where she could rest, covered her medical expenses in full, and quietly began preparing everything she and the children would need. Grace went into labor only weeks later, delivering a healthy boy and 2 healthy girls after a difficult night that left her drained but relieved. Word reached the Cole estate before morning, and Richard's wife, Eleanor, made the decision to bring Ethan to the hospital without explaining why. Ethan assumed the visit had something to do with company matters until he stepped into the room and saw Grace resting beside 3 small bassinets, each one holding a child that unmistakably belonged to him. He stood frozen in the doorway, unable to speak, as the reality of what he was looking at slowly settled into place. Grace watched him carefully, her voice quiet but steady, as she finally told him the truth she had hidden for months. She admitted she had never stopped loving him, that the words she said the night she pushed him away had been a lie meant to free him from a life she believed she was ruining. Ethan sat down beside her, overwhelmed by guilt and disbelief in equal measure, admitting that his own deception, the choice to disguise himself and test the people around him, had planted the first seed of mistrust that eventually grew into everything that followed. The relief of that reunion did not last long before a new threat arrived to disrupt it. Victoria discovered the existence of the 3 children within days, her anger boiling over into threats of a public divorce designed to humiliate the entire Cole family. Her father, a man whose business partnership had propped up several of the company's largest contracts, arrived at the estate demanding a private conversation with Richard. He made his position clear without any softening, stating that if the family publicly acknowledged Grace and her children, he would withdraw his investment entirely and terminate every contract tied to his companies. Richard sat across from him in his office, listening to numbers and consequences that could genuinely cripple the business his own father had built decades earlier. The 2 men argued for nearly an hour, the partner insisting that protecting the company's image mattered more than 1 woman and 3 infants, while Richard found himself, for once, unable to agree with an argument that would have convinced him easily only months before. He asked for time to think, something he rarely allowed himself when it came to business decisions, and spent the following days weighing the cost of loyalty to his son against the cost of loyalty to profit. During those days of silence, Richard watched Ethan visit the hospital every morning before work, holding each child carefully as though afraid they might disappear if he looked away too long. He watched his son speak to Grace with a gentleness that had never existed in his interactions with Victoria, and he began to understand that the family name he had spent his life protecting meant very little if it could not hold room for the people who actually made his son happy. The realization did not arrive easily, but once it settled, Richard found he could no longer justify the choice his business partner was demanding of him. He called the partner back into his office and delivered his answer without hesitation. He told him plainly that the company would accept whatever financial consequences followed because his family had already sacrificed enough chasing an image built on convenience rather than honesty. The partner withdrew his investment within the week exactly as promised, and several contracts collapsed shortly after, costing the company a significant portion of its projected earnings for the year. Richard absorbed the loss without complaint, telling his executives simply that some costs were worth paying. Victoria left the estate permanently once the divorce was finalized, taking with her whatever remained of the arrangement that had never been built on anything real. Madison, whose earlier claims of exposing the truth for the public good had earned her brief attention online, found herself facing a different kind of scrutiny once reporters began digging into her own motives. Stories surfaced, revealing that her decision to release the video had been driven by jealousy and rejection rather than any concern for fairness, and the same public that once praised her turned against her almost overnight. She quietly left the city not long after, her name fading from conversations that once could not stop repeating it. Richard stood before the extended family and remaining business associates and formally acknowledged Grace and the 3 children as members of the Cole family, a declaration that closed the door on months of scandal and public speculation. Grace accepted the recognition with quiet composure, though she made it clear to Ethan privately that acceptance from his family did not erase the months of pain that had passed between them. She told him she could forgive him, but that trust would need time to rebuild itself piece by piece, rather than all at once through a single apology. Ethan agreed without argument, understanding that trust earned through actions carried far more weight than trust promised through words. Over the following months, he showed up every day, caring for the 3 children through sleepless nights and early mornings, learning their individual cries and small habits with the same patience he had once reserved for company reports. He supported Grace's mother through the remainder of her treatment, sitting with her during appointments and never once treating the responsibility as an inconvenience. When strangers made comments about Grace's past selling food on the street, Ethan defended her openly, refusing to let old prejudices resurface unchallenged. He also began changing the way Cole Enterprises treated workers who occupied the lowest rungs of its operations, drivers, vendors, and laborers, who had once been invisible to a company focused entirely on profit margins. Together, Ethan and Grace established a fund dedicated to supporting cab drivers, small food vendors, and pregnant women facing financial hardship, the very struggles they had both lived through firsthand. Grace took direct control of the fund's daily operations, insisting that decisions affecting people in poverty should be made by someone who understood that life personally rather than by executives who had only read about it in reports. Madison had once used a single video to strip away every secret Ethan had been hiding, believing the exposure alone would define the rest of his story. Ethan eventually used that same public attention for a different purpose, speaking openly about the lie he had told, the harm it caused, and the lessons it forced him to learn the hard way. He made it clear, in every interview and public statement that followed, that poverty never determined a person's worth, and that the months he spent driving that broken-down cab had taught him more about honesty than any boardroom ever had. Nearly a year after the scandal first broke, Ethan brought Grace back to the same street corner where their story had first begun, the old cab still parked exactly where he had left it months earlier. He had not planned an elaborate proposal, no photographers, no extravagant venue filled with guests who barely knew them. He simply knelt beside the cab, held out a small ring, and told her that he had once disguised himself to test whether she would love him without a fortune attached to his name. Life, he admitted, had tested him back far more harshly than he ever tested her, and he no longer wanted to test anyone again. He only wanted to spend the rest of his life proving he was worthy of the love she had given him when he had absolutely nothing to offer. Grace said yes without hesitation, and their wedding took place not long after, small and unpretentious compared to the spectacle of his first marriage. Their 3 children sat close by throughout the ceremony. Grace's mother watched from the front row in stable health after months of proper treatment, and Richard and Eleanor stood proudly among the guests, openly welcoming Grace as their daughter for the first time without reservation. Ethan kept the old cab parked outside their new home long after the wedding ended, a permanent reminder of the man he had once pretended to be and the far more expensive lesson that pretending had ultimately cost him. Madison had been the one to expose Ethan Cole's identity to the world, but Grace had exposed something far more important underneath it. Behind the fortune, the family name, and the elaborate test he had designed to protect his heart, Ethan had simply been a man terrified of being loved for the wrong reasons, never fully understanding what real love actually required of him. By the end, he finally understood that true love was never about finding someone who could pass a test he had created. It was about choosing honesty every single day, accepting responsibility when he failed, and refusing to ever again turn another person's heart into an experiment. If this story reminded you that honesty matters more than money, or that real love never needs a test to prove itself, let us know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this journey with Ethan and Grace, make sure you subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next story like this one. Thank you for watching, and we will see you in the next video.